Hi, I'm Elli Wohlgelernter. I'm here with Smoky Simon. It is June the 5th, 2015. Part 2 of our interview. So it occurred to me while listening to the first tape that I'm probably the first person who interviewed you for an hour and a half and never asked you, how did you get the name Smoky?
It's really a very unromantic story. I joined the South African Air Force right after I wrote my final examinations in December 1940. And at the basic training school, we played a lot of sport. And we happened to be in a softball game one day, and I happened to hit a great shot, and the guy yelled, "Great shot, Smoky Joe," from the Kokomo. And that has been with me now for 74 years, or 75 years.
And you just had your 95th birthday on April 20th.
On April 24th.
24th?
Yeah.
Sorry. How do you feel?
I should say gratefully that I'm feeling pretty well. I did have a bit of a rough time the last few months. Some problems with gout and neuropathy, and I had a fall and I had 2 fractures in my pelvis. So I haven't been in my best shape, but I think I'm well on the road to recovery.
Good, good. When we left off last time, we were talking about the actual May 14th, 1948, when you flew the mission over Jordan to see the troop, what's the word? The
troop movement or activity,
activity and placement in it. And then you wrote on the website that you and Boris were debriefed at Army headquarters.
Correct.
Could you tell me what that meeting was like?
It was rather an extraordinary meeting. The members of the General Staff, when they got out of port, I wondered what their reaction was going to be, because the situation was so grim, and they, of course, were so clearly aware of it. And it was a sort of a stone-walled silence. There was no emotional reaction. Are we possibly going to make it? Can we survive it? And so forth. And I said to myself, either these guys are really courageous fellows, or possibly they don't really know what's in store for Israel. And I came away with that feeling. What was the right sentiment? Was I right in thinking that these guys were really such solid fellows that they weren't over influenced by the grim story that we had to report? And I think that probably that version was justified in time.
Do you remember what you told them?
Well, we really just gave them a factual report of the immense force of tanks and armored cars and artillery and petrol Bowsers and support vehicles and so forth. And knowing, of course, that we really had nothing to stop them, as was proved when they overran the Etzion block, and several hundreds were killed, civilians and military personnel. Hundreds were, we didn't know then that hundreds had been taken prisoners of war, and then the whole kibbutz was on fire. So the situation was truly a very grim one.
How many days afterwards did you meet with them?
No, immediately after our flight, we went straight after we landed to report. That was the object of the mission. Really.
Yes. Who was in the room?
There was Yigal Yadin and a number of other senior officers. I really don't recall their names. And then there was Boris Senior, who was the pilot of the aircraft, a Machelnik from South Africa, and myself and an Israeli photographer.
You wrote that during the remaining days of May that month, you flew 5 additional operations in Fairchild and Bonanza aircraft as navigator and bomb chucker outer, dropping mainly 25-kilogram bombs and incendiaries and a few 50-kilo bombs. First of all, how many bombs were on each plane when you flew missions that you were chucking out?
At the end of our session today, Elli, I'll show you a model of the aircraft in which we did the first operational mission of the Israeli Air Force. It's a Bonanza aircraft, civilian aircraft, smuggled out of South Africa by Boris Senior. And you could only really take one bomb with you in the aircraft because you had the bomb on your lap. And the bomb, when you really approach your target and you pull the pin, that bomb was a live bomb. And you know the story of the ticking bomb, anything could happen. So it was quite a hazardous experience, but we had nothing else.
So a plane would go up on a mission with one bomb to chuck and come back?
Yeah. Well, now, usually what we did was we had a box of incendiary bombs.
That consisted of what?
Which caused fires when they hit the ground. And then we used to take empty bottles with us that make a shrieking noise when they go hurtling through the air. From a point of view of it had some psychological effect on the Arabs. But really it was mainly the one bomb that was carried. And after all, it's not so easy to handle a 50-kilo bomb when you're sitting in a small aircraft. But again, that was the position at the time.
Those empty bottles that make a noise, that was shown in the movie Cast a Giant Shadow. Frank Sinatra was in that movie, and he was throwing out those seltzer bottles that made the sound. And when I saw that as a kid, I thought, that's got to be made up Hollywood.
Yeah.
And you're telling me that's exactly what it was.
That's true, yeah. That's true.
Two of the bombing missions you went on in May, one was over Shuafat and one was over Nablus. Do you remember anything specific about those?
No.
Okay.
No.
You then, on June 10th of 48, you flew over Damascus, the first raid on an Arab capital.
Correct.
Can you tell me the details of that flight?
There's an interesting background to that flight. There was going to be a ceasefire, which had been directed by the United Nations Security Council on the 11th of June. And we wanted to show some muscle before the ceasefire. And in quotes, we borrowed a civilian Dakota DC-3, which was owned by a Jewish group in South Africa. And we removed the civilian markings on the aircraft. And that was really our first more serious bombing mission. And on that flight, we carried 80 kilo bombs, boxes of empty bottles, boxes of incendiaries, and we flew. It was around about midnight. I think our attack was somewhere around about 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the morning. And in order to give the Arabs the impression that we had more than one aircraft in the air at the time, we did 6 runs over Damascus. There was some anti-aircraft fire, but nothing really serious. And as I said, we, after dropping the heavy bombs, but what was interesting there, Elli, because we didn't have the equipment to carry the bombs under the wings, even these heavy bombs were inside the aircraft. And when the side door was open and they're handling these very heavy bombs, there was a risk that the bomb chuckers might fall out with the bomb. So we tied them up with ropes, and they handled the bomb from one bomb chucker to the next. And as I said, we did 6 runs over Damascus. Was
that your first time in a Dakota?
Pardon?
Was that your first time in a Dakota?
Yeah, the very first time. It was the first time we had, which was relatively a heavy bomber from our point of view at that time, because as you mentioned, we had the small aircraft, the Fairchilds and Bonanzas and so on.
Your second raid, a week later, the 18th of July, over Damascus, there you flew a B-17.
Yeah, and that was a daytime raid. And the B-17 story is an extremely important and interesting feature. The B-17s, you may recall, Elli, from our earlier interview, that Al Schwimmer's team smuggled 4 B-17s out of the United States. One of them was impounded by the FBI, and the pilot, whose name was Swiftly Schindler, was arrested. And so we were left with 3 B-17s, and they were based together with the other aircraft which Israel was acquiring in Czechoslovakia, as you may remember. The B-17s were flown out from Czechoslovakia on the 15th of July, 48. It was a rather interesting incident. When we were planning the raid, I was very much in favor of dropping all the bomb loads of 3 B-17s over Cairo. And the reason why I recommended that to the Chief of Air Force was that after our night raid on Damascus, all the foreigners left Damascus. They decided it's no longer a healthy place. And my conclusion was that if one Dakota, which is relatively a very small aircraft compared to a B-17, if one Dakota could have had that impact on Damascus, that 3 B-17s could have really a tremendous impact on Cairo. But I was ruled out because we weren't sure how strong Cairo's anti-aircraft defenses were. And so one aircraft went to Cairo, one went to Rafah, or Rafah as it is known, and one to El Arish. And then the B-17s, of course, were available for action. And as you mentioned, we did the first daylight raid on a Arab capital on Damascus in the B-17 that you were referring to.
What's the difference between a night raid and a day raid?
There really isn't any difference. It depends really what your target is. And of course, you're affected by weather conditions and so forth, if the cloud and so on. But really, we had nothing with, that we could use on an Arab capital of significance until we got the B-17s. So I think, again, psychologically, it had a great impact that Amman had already been bombed by smaller aircraft, and now we had bombed Cairo, and now we had bombed Damascus by daylight, and the Air Force was really starting to show some muscle at the time, because, as you said, the raid on Damascus was, I think, around about the 10th of July, was it?
The first one was the 10th, the second was the 18th.
Yeah. So, well, really, that was part of the whole B-17 operational missions. The B-17, you know, was an icon bomber in World War II, mainly in the attacks over Germany. And as far as the Air Force was concerned, it gave us a tremendous leverage. Of course, we so much regretted that we had lost the one B-17, but nevertheless, the B-17s did a wonderful job during the war.
Hold on one second. Yeah, all right, go. On that day of the second bombing of Damascus, the first daylight attack on July 18th, you actually were on 3 missions that day.
Yeah.
That's quite a load for a day's work.
Well, you see, the distances were so short, Ellie. And one thing which really characterized the Air Force was what we call the quick turnaround of the aircraft, to really keep them in the air as much as possible. And so it really wasn't unusual for a B-17 to do 3 raids in one, 3 operations in one day.
You'd come back to base, refuel, put another bomb on the plane?
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even have to refuel because the distances were so short.
Yes, you went to
You
mission.
know, when one thinks of the distances which were covered in World War II, you know, it's this was really very short raids, I must say.
Did you ever have to parachute out of a plane?
No.
You said you were hit 6 or 7 times?
You know, it
Or am I thinking World War II?
that's probably World War II.
You were not hit during bombing raids for Israel?
Yeah, occasionally there were some bullet holes, but fortunately the Arabs didn't have serious anti-aircraft, so we were very lucky in that respect.
You mentioned last time something about the first field hospital plane that you developed with Tel Shomer.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was an Anson aircraft, which was also smuggled out of South Africa, and we set up this plane really as the IDF's first ambulance aircraft. I think we could take about, when we took all the seats out, about 6 beds. And that was when I first met what was his name? He was Director General of Tel Shomer, a most wonderful man. And so at least we were able to use this, again, small civilian aircraft, really quite effectively as an ambulance aircraft. Because what we used to do was, when soldiers or civilians were injured down in the south as a result of the Egyptian army attacks, we could evacuate them at night in this little ambulance aircraft.
What was on the plane? What equipment? What equipment was on the plane?
You know, I suppose the paramedics had, you know, what they would need most in case of injuries and so forth.
Primitive by today's standards.
I would think so.
Yes.
I would think so.
You mentioned, by the way, that you reported to Remez as the chief of the Air Force, but wasn't Yisrael Amir in charge for a while? In charge of the Air Force?
Nominally, yes, but effectively not. Remers was really the chief that commanded the Air Force. Yeah.
Okay, I'm continuing here on your mission specifically. August 15th, 1948, you went on a search for Monty Goldberg and Paltiel Maklev, who were taken POW. Tell me about that story.
Yeah. They were, if I'm not mistaken, they were flying in a Fairchild. And they were on a bombing mission. And then they were shot down. And what we did was every time that one of our, they were shot down by ground fire because it was all low-level operations in the small aircraft. And then we if I remember correctly, we did the search in the area where they should have been.
But what area was that?
Down in the Negev. That was in the Negev.
Northern, southern?
I would say the southern Negev. And unfortunately, there was really nothing we could do about recovering these chaps. And then we had quite a few other airmen who were taken prisoners of war. What happened in another case was we had two crews who were ferrying Norseman aircraft from Rome to Israel. And there was a tremendous sandstorm. And the navigation, they just lost their way completely in this sandstorm. And they were forced to force land in Gaza. And they were taken prisoner of war really until the end of the war. And of course the aircraft were lost as well.
Goldberg and Maklev, were these Machal guys?
Goldberg was Machal and Maklev was an Israeli. Maklev, by the way, was the son of Maklev, who was a very senior officer in the IDF. Yeah.
Where was Goldberg from?
I'm really not sure where he hailed from. He was from South Africa, but I don't know from which town he came.
So he was never found?
No.
In October of 48, you went on a search for the crew of the Viewfighter, Len Fitchett, Dove Sugarman, Stan Andrews. Do you remember that mission?
Yeah, that was really one of the more dramatic missions in the Air Force history at the time. There was an area called the Fallujah Pocket. And the Fallujah Pocket held out very, very firmly against Israeli attacks because it was one of these British fortresses. And it was known as Iraq el-Suveidan. And this really, it was a tremendous bone in our throat as far as the army was concerned in really clearing out that part of the Negev. And incidentally, the commanding officer was Abdul Nasser, who ultimately became president of Egypt and the guy who triggered off the Six-Day War. Now, the bow fighters, by the way, were smuggled out of England. There were 4 bow fighters originally. We really bought 7, but they were largely junk, and they were spruced up in England as best as possible, and 4 really became flyable. And they were smuggled out of England, which was in itself a very interesting story, if I may digress for just a minute. They put up a bogus film company to screen or to record a New Zealand squadron which flew Beaufighters in England in World War II. And this bogus company was set up, and everything was beautifully done. They had narrators, and they had pressmen and cameras and whatnot. And then these Beaufighters took off to do aerobatics and so forth. And the next thing was that they were heard of in France on their way to Israel. Ultimately, only 2 were really serviceable. We were so desperately short of spare parts for these aircraft. So we had tremendous maintenance problems. But coming back to this particular operation on the 18th of October,
20th.
20th of October, we decided to attack Iraq Sevedan with a Beaufighter and to do a low-level attack. And when I briefed the crew, I gave them a very clear directive: you do one attack and one attack only, because it's low level. This fortress is very well defended. Once you lose the element of surprise, it's very dangerous. Then there was a second aspect to this, which was also very serious. There were 3 aircrew, but the Beaufighter only has 2 aircrew. And this guy, Len Fitchett, wanted to, there was Len Fitchett and Sugarman and
Stan Andrews. All 3 Machal?
All 3 Machal.
From?
Fitchett was from Canada, Stan was from America, and Dov Sugarman was from England. And I briefed them for this mission, and I said, guys, 1 run and 1 run only. If you miss, it's too bad. You just can't take a chance. And that's exactly what happened. That the first bombing run wasn't successful. They turned around and did the next one, and of course the defenders of the fortress were ready for them, and the aircraft was shot down. Now again, there was really a lack of discipline, because Stan Andrews had no right to be in that aircraft, but the guys were so enthusiastic about getting onto the raids and being actively involved as much as possible. And he went along with it, which was really an infraction of discipline. And unfortunately, all 3 of them were lost. And the remains of that Beaufighter now are being kept at the Air Force Museum at Herzliya. Yeah, it was a very sad day, actually. We went out right after we had the news that they didn't come back. And we took Sten guns with us and so forth to supply them with food and some weaponry. But no one was alive. The aircraft was still burning when we got there. And there were a Bedouin in the area. And unfortunately, that was an absolute loss to us. 3 good men and one aircraft.
What did it feel like for all of you pilots and Air Force men when you'd lose men?
You know, people really have different reactions to it. Now, Stan Andrews, he came over with a buddy of his from the States. He was an art student at the University of Southern California, and these two guys were like brothers. When he was lost, actually his buddy, whose name was I forget it for the moment. They were both members of 101 Squadron, which was our first fighter squadron, and Stan's buddy was he was on an attack on Elli airfield, and he was shot down. We think he was shot down, but it could have been due to another cause, which I'll mention in a moment. A very interesting fact, and we couldn't find his body. And Stan was so anxious to be on this raid because it was going to be, you might say, a critical operation if we could have taken over that area from the Egyptians. And unfortunately, he lost his life, so both of them were lost. You know, some of them, now, this is an example of such a friendship between these two guys that Stan Andrews was so upset when his buddy was killed over Elli. And he really showed it. You know, he went, and that is something which one has got to be very careful about, the mindsets of men on the squadron when one of their colleagues is killed.
Because morale could be hit
Yeah.
morale.
Yeah. You know, for example, it was also on I think the 18th of October that we lost Modi Alon. Modi Alon was such a wonderful leader, this young Israeli, 25 years of age, who really commanded a bunch of experienced, really war-hardened pilots from World War II. And yet, this young Israeli, who never saw action at all during World War II, commanded their respect and their support. Now, his death had really a tremendous impact on the squadron. But, you know, the guys, after that, they have a drink, and they wish him well in the eternal world, and then they've just got to set about their business. So it's a very interesting question, the impact on colleagues when some of their buddies don't come back from a mission.
I skipped one mission at the August 29th. You went on a reconnaissance over Jerusalem, supply dropping and bombing to check. I mean, tell me about that reconnaissance flight on 29th of August over Jerusalem.
Yeah. You know, I think really what happened there was either they were preparing for some function, and they were rather interested to know what may be happening in the area. And if I'm not mistaken, we had an army guy with us, but it really had no special significance.
Hugo Alperstein was the captain on the flight.
Hugo was a South African Machelnik as well. Yeah.
You wrote down supply dropping and bombing possibilities. That's the notes of the target or mission was supply dropping and bombing possibilities.
That was probably then reconnaissance for that purpose, you know.
To see where and how you can drop supplies?
The best way, yeah.
Yes.
You know, because they're trees and whatnot, so you've got to know the geography of the area and so forth. Yeah.
What was it like looking at Jerusalem from the air?
Jerusalem from the air was, I wouldn't say that there was anything really special about that. You know, you're going out for a specific purpose, and I guess it's really part of the day's work, you know.
Your last bombing mission, flying mission, the 28th of December, bombing Tarshiba,
Yeah.
Tarshiba, Tarshiba.
Exactly.
But bombed Suhamata by mistake, Suhamata. What happened?
Yeah. You know, the Arab villages are so close to each other. And it was just a navigational mistake, actually, that you know, they are so close and there are so many similarities in their overall appearance that it's really quite easy to make a mistake, especially when you're zigzagging because of enemy fire and so forth. So it was simply a navigational mistake, yeah.
If I added up correctly, you flew 26 total missions.
24 missions,
24?
if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had really a twofold job, the operational missions and as chief of
Air operations.
Of air operations.
So speak to me about this. Dan Telkowski asked you to join his staff.
Correct.
And what did it mean to be chief of air operations?
It really meant you're the main liaison man in headquarters with a different squadron. So you really have your bombers and you have your fighter aircraft and you have transport aircraft and so forth, because whilst the war was on, there was one very vital operation which is taking place on a daily basis, and that was Air Transport Command. Now, Air Transport Command consisted of the transport aircraft which Swimmer again smuggled out of the United States, the C-46s and the Skymasters and the Constellations. And that kept the air bridge going between Israel and Czechoslovakia. And that was the only channel of communication which was open to Israel at the time. So, you know, we had to liaise with Air Transport Command, because what we even did was, I think at our last interview, we spoke about the Messerschmitts being flown over in these transport aircraft. Now, then, and of course, the flying had to be done by night because of the Egyptian Spitfires during the day, because these transport aircraft are really undefended. And what we did was that after they had offloaded the aircraft in Israel to be reassembled, then we used to again bomb them up with bombs inside the transport aircraft and with a couple of bomb chuckers, so that even on their way back to Czechoslovakia, we sort of utilized them as part of the bombing effort. So Air Transport Command was a terribly important part of the whole operation. If time permits, we'll come to it afterwards. When that air bridge was terminated in August 1948, it was a tremendous blow to the Air Force. Because then we had just acquired 50 Spitfires from Czechoslovakia, and that's how we were going to bring them over to Israel, and the air bridge was stopped. And that's when this whole new operation had to be developed if time permits, because it's so interesting, of getting the Spitfires into Israel.
Okay, we'll get back to that.
Yeah.
You were the rank of Rav Ser, and you were a major.
Correct.
How many men did you have reporting to you?
I had a very small staff. We had a couple of chaps who were handling the bomber squadron, the fighter squadron, air transport command. We may have been, I guess, 7 or 8 or 9 at most. It was really a very small staff. And incidentally, before we had developed our codes and ciphers for the Air Force, we had, there were 81 South African flying men at the different squadrons, and we used to pass a lot of our messages in Afrikaans until we got our codes and ciphers. And I often used to think, what do the Egyptians and the Syrians think the Jews are up to now? Was it? It was quite humorous getting the messages in Afrikaans. Yeah.
You had 425 flying and operational personnel in the Air Force?
Yeah, and then we found a 426th man as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, you wrote about being the Air Force's representative to the United Nations mission.
Yeah.
That included Chaim Herzog, who later became Israel's president. Tell me a little bit about that mission, what your job was.
Really, it wasn't terribly serious. It was really, whenever we were being accused of, because bear in mind that there was a United Nations sanction on the export of weaponry to Israel, and of course they had a number of complaints that there was this infraction and that, and so forth, and we sort of had to wiggle our way out of it as to really what happened. But also, this was quite interesting. The Arabs used to fly a daily flight from Amman to Beirut in civilian aircraft. And they used Ansons and taking 8, 10, 12 passengers. And they used to do a shortcut over the Kinneret, and we really warned them repeatedly that they're really invading Israeli airspace, and we warned them that they're running the risk of being shot down. And it actually happened that on one day, Asa Weitzman and the guy Gidi Richtman were on patrol, and they see this Anson coming over, and they formated on him and gave him instructions to land. And he disobeyed the instruction. He just kept on flying. And the next thing is Gidi Richtman opened up on this aircraft and shot it down. And there was a very well-known British war correspondent from World War II, Richard Dimbleby. He was one of the passengers on that aircraft. So after I heard about this incident, I asked Asa Weitzman and Gidi Lichtman, I'd like to have a talk with them about this incident. And I said to them, now guys, tell me, how could you fellas shoot down a civilian aircraft? You know, he's completely undefended. It's true he's invaded Israel airspace. It's true that we've warned them time and time again. But nevertheless, you know, it's not according to the ethics of what we wanted to observe in the Air Force. And Gidi Lichtman then told me, he said, you know, when we formated on them, and I told this guy, land, and he just disobeyed, he neglected it completely. He said, when I saw those goddamn Arab beards, he says, I couldn't resist opening up. That was the explanation for shooting down the aircraft.
What was the atmosphere as 1948 turned to 1949?
The atmosphere already in 1948, really in the midst of the heat of battle, you might say, we realized we've got to start training Israelis. This is going to be an Israeli Air Force, not a Machal Air Force. And we already had the conversion school in Czechoslovakia for converting the pilots onto the Messerschmitt, the Czech Messerschmitts. We had a flying school in Italy, near Rome, Urbe. We had a flying school at St. Jean's in Israel, up in the north. We did preliminary training in South Africa. And we realized that we're going from the phase of battle into the phase of training and building up the Israeli Air Force. And when the fighting was actually over on the 7th of January, 1949, there was really a lot of emphasis on training. And in fact, we had our first wings parade on the 4th of March, 1949, in which 4 Israelis got their wings. One was Moti Hod, who commanded the Air Force in the Six-Day War. And then there was Danny Shapiro, became a famous test pilot. And there was Tibi Ben Shachar, who became the chief pilot of Arkia. And Shaya Gazit, who also had a very splendid record. And that was wonderful already to see these Israelis, guys getting their wings. And the important thing is we had such wonderful instructors for these guys, chaps who were aces from World War II. And that was really, you might say, the whole essence of the Machal story, that these 4,800 Machalniks who came over from 59 countries, who had battle experience, but particularly the Air Force, because they were mainly from the States, South Africa, Canada, Britain. There were guys who had 12 aircraft shot down in World War II, like McElroy. And the instructors were really excellent, and the material was excellent. The Israelis, from the early days. I remember I was actually on the selection committee of young Israelis to be trained for pilots courses. And a guy like Benny Peled, I said, that guy's first-class material. And he became commander of the Israeli Air Force. And so there was this switch from the
war
battle arena to the training arena. And guys like George Lichter and Ruby O'Gorton were fantastic instructors, these chaps.
What made them so great?
They were wonderful pilots. And they realized the sort of material, they realized they had the material of turning out excellent men. And you had that combination of good material and excellent instructors. And look what has happened to the Israeli Air Force. It's
one of the very best in the world.
Yeah, man for man. The Americans love training with our Air Force. The Romanians, the Italians, the Greeks, the Turks, until we had our breach with them. To them, it's most wonderful to fly with the guys of this caliber. And
what language did you all speak from so many different countries?
Yeah, English was the language of the Air Force until September 1948, September 49. And then the Air Force really switched to Hebrew. But until then, it was really English.
How good was your Hebrew?
Very poor, I'm afraid. I was, I think, one of the worst students around. Yeah, it was, you know, because the Air Force guys came from 16 countries, by the way, the flying personnel. So really there were a lot of languages, the Russians and Czechs and Romanians and, you know, small numbers. The big numbers came from the Anglo-Saxon countries.
Of the 4,800 Machalniks, how many were in the Air Forces versus on the ground? Percentage or numbers?
Of Air Force personnel?
No, the Machalniks. Of the 4,800 Machalniks, how many went to...
No, there were 4,800, but that was Army, Navy, and Air Force.
Yes, I'm saying, what's the breakdown of that 4,800?
Oh, I see. How many were Air Force personnel? I would say, you know, I said we have 426 flying crew, but they weren't all here at the same time. Guys came in the war started in May, you know. I was in the first batch of guys. And they came all the way through to December and January when the war ended. But I would say in toto, there would have been, say, there were 426 flying crews. I would say that there must have been about 300 to 400 mechanics and armorers and electricians and so forth. And by the way, you know, in 101 Squadron, the guys used to sleep under the wings of the aircraft so they could start working at first light the next day. You know, there was such an amazing spirit. And everything was really hot, you know. It was truly amazing.
What uniforms were you wearing?
Very simple uniforms. And, you know, we did, for example, I had an American Air Force cap. and our khaki uniforms, and that was it. And at first, for several months, we didn't even have ranks.
Then how did you know who was who and who was...
Yeah, that's right. You know, and then, you know, because the whole structure had to be crystallized. It was unbelievable. You know, I mean, everything was so austere at the time. I mean, the food, even the flying crews. For breakfast, you'd get a boiled egg and 6 olives and a slice of lechem. And that was it. You know, it was...
Were you hungry all day?
I wouldn't say we were hungry all day, but you weren't overfed, not by means. And you know, when they could get a couple of chickens from a kibbutz and so forth, that was really a gift, like manna from heaven.
All right, one second. Yep. By the way, sorry, you were saying?
I was saying, you know, when we really come to the conclusion of the fighting stage of the War of Independence, it's really a very dramatic story. And but you know, I'm leaving that to you. You've probably got that on your.
What are you referring to specifically?
You know, specifically the last day of the fighting on the 7th of January, 1949.
Yes, sir. Tell me. Tell me.
And yeah.
What do you remember? What do you remember about
that? The United Nations Security Council directed that there would be a ceasefire on the 7th of January 1949. The Air Force, 101 Squadron in the Air Force, had been moved down to Chatzor, the air base in the south, because we were doing a lot of air-ground support operations. We really use the same tactics as was used in World War II, where you have an Air Force officer attached to the frontline troops of the Army with radio communication, and he's in touch with the Air Force. And there may be a switch of targets, depending on the needs of the Army at the time, but it was really very, very closely coordinated, so that the Air Force knew all the time which were the primary targets, or if there should be a change of targets, or if the weather should change and you may have to change your operations and so forth. And on that particular day, the 7th of January, we had 2 Spitfires, and Elli, if I may just digress for one moment, I would like to cover how the Spitfires got to Israel, because that's an amazing story.
Yes.
We had 2 Spitfires on patrol in the battle area, and they saw a formation of 4 Spitfires coming from the east, and our 2 guys, by the way, who were both non-Jewish Canadians, they tackled the 4 aircraft. They shot down 3 of them, and the 4th one was shot down by a Machal tank crew. You know, we only had 3 tanks in the army during the war that British deserters took over when the Brits were evacuating Palestine. And there was a Machal, and only the Machalniks really knew how to handle tanks. And they shot down the 4th aircraft. Later in the day, we had 4 Spitfires in the battle area, and there was a formation of 19 aircraft coming from the east. And our guys, the 4, tackled them. They shot down 1 of the aircraft, and they damaged 3, and then our IAF pilots disengaged. So what was the story? The first 4 aircraft that were engaged were not Egyptians. They were Royal Air Force. Completely unknown and completely unexpected. And afterwards, when we got the story that Britain was responsible for the defense of the Suez Canal, and apparently what happened was that when the Israeli forces drove the Egyptians out of the Negev into Sinai, the Brits became very concerned as to whether the Israelis might go right up to the Suez Canal. And then they sent out these 4 aircraft to do a armed reconnaissance of the area, and they were shot down by our chaps, and they never got back to their base. So the British realized that something has happened to them. How can 4 aircraft disappear? So then they sent out this formation of 15 Tempests, which were the latest aircraft that the Brits had, and 4 Spitfires, 19 aircraft in a formation. And as I said, we had 4 Spitfires. Then we realized they were Brits and not Egyptians. So the Egyptians were flying Spitfires, the British were flying, and we were flying Spitfires. And so the day ended with 5 of the Royal Air Force aircraft being shot down, 3 had been damaged, and we're not at war with Britain. So what's the status of all this? The next day, the Chief of Air Force called a meeting of staff officers to try and assess what the likely fallout was going to be. And guys expressed their opinions and so on and so forth. And the first guy to come out of the meeting was an American pilot, Danny Kravitz, and sitting in the next room was an ex-RAF pilot, Maraiyan. And Danny Kravitz comes out of the meeting looking very serious and somber. And Maraiyan says to him, Danny, what in the hell is going to happen? So he said, if you give me your solemn word of honor that you won't breathe a word, I'll tell you. He says, we've taken an operational decision to bomb London. So Maraiyan looks at him and says, Danny boy, I couldn't care less. I come from Manchester. that was his response to the threat of bombing London. So really the war ended, or the fighting phase ended, on a highly dramatic note. It was a development which was completely unexpected, because, as I said, the ceasefire had to take place as from 4 o'clock that afternoon. And of course there was hell to pay in the British House of Commons, because Churchill was then in the opposition. And I remember one of his remarks, he says, the way how he grunted, he says, when is Britain going to stop this squalid warfare against the young Jewish state? And because a number of other things, and you may have had it on your notes perhaps, on the 18th of November, our Air Force shot down a British Mosquito, which was doing high-level reconnaissance. And this used to bug the hell out of us, because we had nothing that could reach him. The Mosquito was the fastest aircraft in World War II. And this guy used to do his reconnaissance, starting from Ramat David and covering all our airfields and sharing the intelligence with the Egyptians. And Bimikre, on this date of the 18th November, our very, very primitive radar picked up the British aircraft, and the guy usually used to fly at about 32,000 feet. And that day he happened to be flying at about 27,000 feet. And we had 2 P-51s on 101 Squadron. And we advised the squadron that this Mosquito is on his way down. Try and do something about it. So an American boy who was very good on P-51s, a lot of experience, he went up in a P-51, and he was really staggering at that height, and his oxygen wasn't too good, and it was already clear that he was suffering but from anoxia, because he said, I see a 4-engined aircraft. Now, Mosquito's only got 2 engines. So Sid Cohen, who was his squadron commander, realized that the guy's got a bit of anoxia. He says, so Sid Cohen says, hook onto him and open up. And this is what happened. He hooked onto this Mosquito, and he says, heavens, my guns have jammed after his first burst. Unknown to him, in his first burst, he shot the Mosquito down. And you can imagine a fighter pilot who shoots down an enemy over his own base. And this Mosquito just came tumbling out of the sky. The fragments fell into the sea and onto the land. And Churchill, actually, when in his criticism in the House of Commons, also commented that the Brits had lost this Mosquito aircraft, which was doing aerial reconnaissance over Israel. So really, we had quite a tangle with the Brits, and as you may remember, I think from our first story, that the MI6, the British intelligence, and Scotland Yard were also amongst our protagonists in smuggling the aircraft over to Israel. So the war really ended on that very dramatic note. And I think one can really sum it up by saying that Israel's victory in the War of Independence was unparalleled in military history. I mean, the odds were so overwhelmingly against Israel at the start of the war that Britain, America, and the Arabs were convinced the war would be over within 2 weeks. And it very nearly was. If the four Messerschmitts didn't attack the Egyptian army on the 29th of May, the war would have been over in 2 weeks.
As the war is going on from May till January,
Yeah.
were you all trying to get a sense of, are we winning, are we losing? Was the talk of militarily, are we doing okay, are we knocking down enough, are we defending enough? What was that scorecard keeping like?
I tell you, the war started off very badly for us. The Egyptian Spitfires were bombing and strafing Israel with impunity. The first Spitfire that was shot down by Machelnik at Sder Dov at the Tel Aviv airfield, who was manning a machine gun. And this guy came in low, and he got a very lucky shot. He hit the Spitfire's glycol tube, and the guy crashed on the beach at Herzliya. But things were so difficult for us at the time. There was Latrun, which we just couldn't capture, and the losses there were horrendous. And they were using ships to bombard Israel. And we didn't have tanks, and we had very primitive artillery, and we didn't have a single combat aircraft, and we didn't have a single anti-aircraft gun. I'm a firm believer that the mighty hand of the Almighty was with us, because to have won that war was really amazing. By July 1948, the Arabs occupied 70% of Israel's land area, 70%. From October onwards, as you see, as I mentioned, we had the air bridge with Czechoslovakia. We were flying in material for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force. It was an ongoing story 24 hours of the day. And we were getting stronger, and we were being better equipped, and the Air Force was growing, and the Machelniks were coming in, and the aircraft were being brought in, the Messerschmitts which were brought in the big transport aircraft. And here I'd just like to tell you shortly about the Spitfires. Israel acquired 50 Spitfires from Czechoslovakia in August 1948. And Dafka, that month, due to American and British pressure, the Czechs decided to terminate the arrangement of using Czechoslovakia as a base. We were in terrible trouble because we were going to do the same thing with the Spitfires, disassemble them, bring them over in the aircraft, reassemble them in Israel. And then this Bruch happened. Now, the distance between Zatek in Czechoslovakia, the base, and Tel Nov is 2,400 kilometers. A fully laden Spitfire has got flying endurance for about 1.5 hours. And this flight meant 6 hours of flying in the Spitfire. Then Sam Pomerantz, bless his soul, was an American pilot who was also an aviation engineer. And he had a crazy idea. He stripped the Spitfire of its guns, the cannons, the radio equipment, the navigation equipment, the cameras, of everything. And he fitted fuel tanks beneath the wings, under the belly, and even in the cockpit. He increased the fuel capacity from 85 to 379 gallons. And then we had the first flight, is this thing going to work? We had a South African guy, a very experienced Spitfire pilot, who did all the test flying in Czechoslovakia before the flights of the Spitfires to Israel. And it seemed as though there's a fair chance. So the idea was to ferry the first 6 Spitfires from Czechoslovakia. One of them crashed, and we were left with 5. And of the 5, 2 of them, Boris Senior, a very experienced pilot, and Modi Alon, this outstanding Israeli pilot, had fuel problems on their way over. Now, without navigation equipment and without radio communication, we had a C-46, which was the mothership, and she led this formation. And we had very good navigators on board, and they really watched the Spitfires in the formation all the time. But 2 of them signaled that they've got fuel problems. And the mothership told them, force land at Rhodes Island, which is part of the Grecian territory. And these 2 aircraft flown by Boris Senior, the blokes landed. Greece was having a revolution at the time. The communists were fighting the army. And these guys were accused of being supporters of the communists, and they were thrown into jail. And the 2 aircraft were lost. The Mossad got them out of jail 2 weeks later, and we never recovered the 2 Spitfires. And so only 3 aircraft reached Israel: Sam Pomerantz and Sid Cohen and another Cohen, also South African. At least 3 of them came through. But our guys learned so much from that operation. Now the army decided that their main offensive against the Egyptian army, the IDF, said, we want to start before the end of December. And they set a date of the 22nd of December. And we couldn't promise them that we could get all these Spitfires through in time. So then we arranged, and it was incredible, that 4 ferry flights brought over 22 Spitfires, and all of them made it to Israel. We had problems when they land over here, the shortage of spare parts and the maintenance and so on and so forth. In any event, we had the bulk of the Spitfire force available for the Army's main offensive. And as I said, the tactics which we used were largely the tactics used in World War II of close air-ground support, with the Air Force guy knowing exactly what the Army intends doing and communicating with the Air Force. And so the big battle against the Egyptians really took place over that period from the 22nd of December to the 7th of January. And so to sum it up, really, the War of Independence was Israel's longest war, from the 14th of May to the 7th of January, 8 months. It was Israel's costliest war. 6,300 civilians and military personnel were killed. thousands were disabled and injured. And when you think of 6,300 being killed, and the Yishuv had up to 650,000 people, 1% of the entire nation was actually killed in the War of Independence. So it was really not only the costliest war and the longest war, but Israel's most fateful war. If we had lost that war, we wouldn't be meeting here today.
Correct, correct. What was the mood in the country at January 7th when the country has just lost 1% of its population?
Well, there was a mood of appreciation that we won the war, and especially with, all the civilians were so involved because it was such a small nation, and everybody was sandbagged. Every building was a sandbag against attacks. And suddenly the war was over, and Israel came out on top. And so really there was the sadness because of the losses that had been incurred, and the gratification that Israel had won the war.
You didn't answer the specific question about the scorecard. In other words, did you sense during the war, did it change during the war? You were winning, you're losing.
Yeah.
Is a good week a bad week?
Okay. So, as I mentioned, in July, 70% of the country was occupied. We were getting more equipment. More mechanics were coming through for the Air Force. And the Army as well. I'm sorry, I sort of mention the Air Force all the time because I'm looking at it from an Air Force perspective. And by October, there was really a perceptible change of the tide.
In July, you're thinking we need to just buy some more time?
That's right. We're still really on the defensive, but we are more aggressive on our defensive. And then we started taking over the initiative. And July, August, September, October, within 3 months, Damascus and Cairo and Amman had been bombed. King Farouk, the flagship of the Italian Navy, had been sunk by commandos, mechanics and Israelis. We had really captured a large part in October. The Upper Galil and the Lower Galil were liberated. Ben Dunkelman, who commanded the 7th Brigade, a highly decorated Canadian officer, was the commander of the 7th Brigade, and they did a fantastic job in the Galil. And then the central Negev and the northern Negev were liberated. And by the way, amongst the forces that fought with the Palmach, the French played a very significant part, the French commandos. And they were commanded by a non-Jewish guy, Tadi Difre. So the Galil was liberated, the central Negev was liberated, and so we were really, and then we were shooting down aircraft. From the air alone, the Israel Air Force shot down 24 of enemy aircraft, apart from the aircraft destroyed on the ground at El Arish and Bir Hama. So we were really on the up and up.
And when did you say to yourself, okay, we've won. Well, it's not over, but we've won?
We couldn't say that until the main offensive against the Egyptians. That was really the culmination. Are we going to make it? And Yigal Allon and the army did a fantastic job. And the Air Force just threw everything it had into it. We were using the C-46s and the Constellations also with bomb chuckers. We threw everything we had into it. it was so intensive, it was so concentrated. And by the 7th of January, after this unexpected victory over the Royal Air Force, it was, feelings were so mixed of joy and gratification, and to come out of it as we did.
How many days off did you get?
You never had days off, really. During the war, actually, a very good friend of ours, one of the Army liaison officers that were attached to my department, he took us on a Tiyul for a couple of days, and the air crews, we had a recreation facility for them at Nahariya, and those guys, I think they used to get about a week off. In headquarters, we really didn't, we never took off. There was somebody going all the time.
They got a week off in what, a month?
No, for the whole period.
For the whole period, 1 week?
Yeah. And then, the amazing thing is that every pilot on 101 Squadron and on 69 Squadron, they all wanted to fly. It was, there was so much enthusiasm about it. First, you're fighting from a defensive standpoint, and then you know that we're getting on top of the horse.
Your sense. By the way, I meant to ask you. I forgot, going way back. The first flight on May 14th. How long was that flight over Jordan and back?
I would say, again, because we did a couple of runs, and we also flew over the Jordanian airfields, 2 airfields, and whilst we were over of Mafraq, one of the airfields, we saw a Spitfire take off. We really weren't worried about him because we were on our way back and we were flying into Sun, and we were pretty sure that we were safe or okay. I would say the flight may have been between 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay. You talked about there was no ranking and structure
at the beginning.
At the beginning, who was the person responsible for making order and ranking and structure?
There were a number of guys. For example, you have your the mechanical guys were setting up the maintenance department, and then you had your armament officer, and then you had your admin guy, and then you had your operational personnel. So, we were fitted into slots, but everybody was Chaim and Smoky, and it wasn't Sir, and, you didn't have any of that.
Okay.
And everybody calls the Chief of Air Force Aaron. So there it is.
They call a generation of American fighters who fought in World War II the greatest generation. But you and the Machaniks who came, it's greatest generation kaful eser, times 10. You didn't just fight a war that had to be won. You established the State of Israel. How do you put that in your memory?
On Israel's 60th anniversary, which was really our last Machal reunion, I mentioned Thanks. I mentioned in my speech to the Machaniks, and I ended it up as follows. You came, you fought, you conquered. And you will always have the gratification of knowing that you were part of the history. Oh, a bit emotional. Sorry. And I said, you will always have the gratification of knowing that you made a contribution to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. And I mentioned there are 58 Muslim states in the world, and there are 82 Christian states. And there is one Jewish state, which we believe will be there until the end of time. Israel.
Do you believe it will be till the end of time?
Yep.
There are two separate tracks to this story. One is the establishment of a state in the 20th century and the fight to make that state happen, Israel. The other is the return of the Jewish people to their land.
Right.
You feel both of those tracks?
Yeah. You know, the ingathering of the exiles, as the Bible predicted and the prophets predicted. You know, and it's all happening. But there is so much that's going on, it's difficult to digest it all. When one thinks of really what is being achieved in this little country, it's simply incredible.
And how do you look at yourself and say, and I was one of the handful that made it happen?
Look, I consider myself very fortunate that I was alive at this particular time in history and that I was really able to contribute something. I mean, we never dreamt when we were in World War II how valuable that experience was going to be for the Jewish state. I mean, these guys who came over, and I'm thinking particularly of the Air Force guys, they were outstanding men in their field, and here you come along with thousands of guys from 59 countries bringing their combined experience. And that's what Yitzhak Rabin said. He said that you came to us when we needed you most, during our dark and uncertain days of our war of independence. He said, you brought us not only your experience, you gave us not only your experience, but your lives as well. By the way, 143 Machaniks were killed during the war. 19 flying crews were killed, and 9 non-Jewish flyers were killed. They buried in the British military cemetery in Haifa. And he said that the people of Israel and the state of Israel will always cherish the contribution made by Machal. And Ben Gurion put it, he said that Machal was the diaspora's greatest contribution to the survival of the state of Israel.
נכון. נכון, נכון. Yeah, that's right. Okay, we'll call it a day. I thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
I often imagine what it would have been like. I was born 20 years too late. But one cannot imagine life and death on the line for the country, the whole country, the entire Yishuv.
Yeah. As I said, you know, I really consider that I had the privilege of being alive at that time, at that moment in history, and being able to contribute something.
Is there anything you would have done differently? Is there anything you would have done differently?
I don't think so. You know, I had the feeling when I signed on for the Air Force in World War II that to me, I had a duty to the Jewish people after what the Germans had done to them. And, but the Israeli scene was different because there's also the emotional aspect involved. Our own people. Yeah. But really, the victory was a near miracle. So I believe that the Almighty used His mighty hand to help us.
What is your message to the future generations?
Well, let me tell you that I'm involved in the Lone Soldiers picture in Israel now.
The Michael Levine Center?
The Michael Levine Center. Last year, there were about 330 Machelniks who came to serve. This year, they think there might be up to 450. So the tradition of Machal is living on. It's continuing. It's fantastic. And I've been giving introductory talks to some of the groups of the new Machelniks who arrived, to tell them how the whole story of volunteering began and the role that they played and throughout the years and so on. So, firstly, it's wonderful that the tradition continues, that young Jews are ready to defend the state of Israel. He may be living. Most of the Machelniks now coming from the US and from France. Up to a couple of years ago, there were a lot of Brits and South Africans and so on, but the center of gravity has changed a bit because of the problems in France. And now what we're really trying to do is to make life as comfortable as we can for these lone soldiers. And accommodation for them, because when you hear the stories, some of them were in the army or sleeping on the beach. And so we are really trying to tackle that problem now. But the wonderful thing is that this spirit continues, that these young Jews are ready to put their necks on the line for defense of Israel. In October of last year, the Minister of Defense gave them a lovely party. Which festival was it? Sukkot. And They had about 150 machaniks there, some of whom were serving. And now what's so good is we're trying to get as many machaniks who have finished their service in Israel to volunteer at the Michael Levine Center. One of the big problems now is the army wants these people to come 2 months before they actually get inducted, and the problem is accommodation. It's a major problem now. So we're trying to see what we can do to help them. Machal actually made a very nice contribution to the Michael Levine Center in Israel. We extended the premises, we added to the facilities, and now we feel that the biggest mission that we can do is to see how best to help the land soldiers.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, great.